So, doctor, we have a question about it. In your
Okay.
work, you state that embryonic selection will be common. From the right, who shall be limits of that practice?
So I think it will be common. It will be more common in some places than others. Uh, Now, so this assumes that it can be shown to be safe and effective. If it's not safe and it's not effective, it shouldn't be used at all. And that's a very important first regulatory step. In the US, we have the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. In Europe, they have the European Medicines Agency. I'm sure Colombia has something similar that decides whether drugs or medical devices or procedures are sufficiently safe and effective to be used. If it's not safe and effective, it shouldn't be used at all. So that's the first and I think most important regulatory issue. Once you get past that, I think different countries will do different things. The Vatican City is unlikely ever to allow this or approve it. Not that there's all that many people having babies in the Vatican City, but they will never like this. In the United States, there are some conservative states that probably will try to limit or ban it. There are other states like California that will welcome it. I think if you look internationally, I suspect this would be popular in parts of East Asia, in Singapore, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, South Korea. I think it would be fairly popular in Australia. Uh, I think it would be, might turn out to be, hard to be sure, popular in Scandinavia. I don't really know what the reception would be like in Latin America and South and Central America. Um, I think that in Germany, it probably would be heavily restricted because the German historical experience with genetics and humans is very, very ugly. So some countries will love it and support it. Some countries will hate it and ban it. Even apart from what the country does, different individuals will have different views. So I think almost all of these ethical questions work at two levels. At one level, there's the individual level. Would I want to do this? Would I want my family and friends to do this? Am I in favor of this or opposed to this for me personally? And then the second level is, should my society allow it, encourage it, ban it, discourage it, etc.? Sometimes I think my society should allow things that I would never do. I hate cigarette smoking. It killed my father. My wife is a retired lung doctor, and she treated many patients who died from cigarette smoking. But I don't think we should ban cigarette smoking because I think the issues, the problems banning would cause would be large. So some countries will want to ban this. Some countries will want to encourage it. Some people will want to do it. Some people won't want to do it. And I think that's fine. There doesn't have to be one answer that fits for everybody.
Okay, we understand that, Dr. Greely. We actually have one more question about in your academic career, which debates or moment have you reflect most deeply on the risk of eugenetic?
In my academic career, what has
Um,
led?
okay, so
So your the audio is not great,
yeah,
and so,
it's not good. Yeah, that's right.
so I'm having
Um,
some trouble understanding you
yeah,
sometimes.
we're having so much trouble with that. I'm gonna repeat that question. So,
Okay.
looking back on your academic career, which debates or moment have made you reflect most of deeply on the risk of eugenetics?
The risk of genetics or eugenics?
Eugenics.
Eugenics.
Yeah.
Okay, so well, I think one of those moments is right now when I see the increase in interest mainly among very rich, very entitled, very annoying, molestante, um, uh, tech bros like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, their interest in having super babies uh, has caused me a great deal of concern and unhappiness. It's not a huge amount because I don't think we can make super babies. We don't know how to make super babies. We don't know what genetic variations cause babies to be stronger, healthier. Well, some healthier. We know things that make them unhealthy, but we don't know what makes people smarter. We don't know what makes people better at music or at sports or at math or any of those things. And we may never know that. The one thing we know about human behaviors and genetics is normal and above normal behaviors seem to be affected by hundreds of different genes. So many that we may never figure out what combination works. And we may never know what bad things come with. Let's say we did know some genetic variations that led to higher intelligence, however you define intelligence. Maybe those higher variations also lead to a higher rate of mental illness or a higher rate of cancer or something else. I think super babies are likely to be scientifically impossible, or at least highly unlikely for the next 100 years and maybe forever, because genetics is complicated and brains are even more complicated than genetics. And the genetics of brains is complicated multiplied by very, very, very complicated. So I think that's unlikely, but this surge of interest is going to lead people to do stupid things that will not work and may end up harming babies. So that's sort of my biggest practical concern or immediate concern. The deepest problem I have, though, with genetics involves questions of disability rights. So, for example, some forms of deafness are genetic. You could, parents who wanted to avoid having a deaf child, where the deafness that runs in their family is caused by genes. Most deafness is not genetic, as far as we know, but some is. They could choose not to transfer embryos that would become deaf and only transfer embryos that would not be deaf. Many deaf people think there's nothing wrong with being deaf. It's just another way of being human. And that this would be, in a sense, almost genocide against deaf people. I think that's a really difficult, hard question. I think it is harder with some kinds of things that are viewed as disabilities. So, deafness or some high functioning variants of autism or short stature, achondroplasia, the little people, those are not very life limiting. There are other genetic disabilities like Tay-Sachs disease, which are extremely life limiting. Every baby born with Tay-Sachs disease dies after 2 or 3 years. So I think for some of the things that many people view as disabilities that are relatively mild, I understand and appreciate the concern of people with those disabilities that genetics will be used to reduce the number of people who share their lives, their way of being. It sends the message that society thinks that they should not exist. It reduces the amount of research into dealing with the problem. It reduces the amount of doctors who go into treating that problem. It reduces the social support for people with that problem. Another sort of good example of that is Down syndrome or trisomy 21. This is the people with Down syndrome typically have low intelligence. Sometimes it's pretty functional intelligence, people who can, with help, live by themselves and work at menial jobs. Sometimes it's very low intelligence. Um, Many parents don't want to have a child with Down syndrome. Many people who have siblings or children with Down syndrome think this is really wrong, that Down syndrome is just another way of being human, and that Down syndrome people are happy and lovable and should not be eliminated. There's some statistics from Iceland where most people in Iceland who are pregnant get prenatal tests, and if the test shows that the fetus would be a baby with Down syndrome, they almost always terminate the pregnancy. And so almost no one is being born with Down syndrome in Iceland. Normally, you would expect about one birth in about 700 to have Down syndrome. So I think the disability questions are actually genuinely hard intellectual and ethical questions. Those are the ones that, as an intellectual matter, an ethical matter, puzzle me the most. As a practical matter right now, what bothers me the most is a bunch of very rich, arrogant people deciding they want to have super babies when it can't, I think, be done, and it increases a belief that intelligence and value can be determined genetically, a belief that I think is both scientifically and ethically wrong.
Okay, so let's compare that idea, Dr. Greely. You consider that change of DNA in Down patients could be benefit to the socially?
Otra vez, por favor.
Okay, so to compare that idea you propose us, you think that change in the ADN in the patients could be benefit to the socially?
So I think there are some DNA changes that we understand well, that there's some variations in DNA that we understand well that can cause a great deal of suffering to people who have them, can cause serious, severe disability and early death, that can cause people to get cancer over and over again. I think families and society as a whole would probably be better off if there were fewer people born with those terrible disabilities. However, I think that's not a decision that should be forced on people, but one that should be left to the individual parents to make a decision. Do they want to have a child with Tay-Sachs disease or not? Do they want to have a child with that's deaf or not? Actually, on the deafness, one interesting twist is some deaf parents actually want to have a deaf child. And that leads to, I think, the interesting question: if parents were born with a child who could hear normally and they then deafened the child, that would be a crime, I think, everywhere. Child abuse. The child would be taken away from them. If instead they choose before birth to transfer an embryo that would be deaf, is that different? Is that the same? So I think there are situations where parents can and should be able to make the decision that they don't want they want to have a healthy child and not a child that has serious that will suffer and cause problems for not just the child, him or herself, but for the whole family. But that should be a decision that the parents make and not the government.
Okay.
And so I'm not sure from the question. There are really two different ways to do this. I've been talking about embryo selection. where you make an embryo and you test it and you decide whether or not to try to make that into a baby. You can also test it if it's an old-fashioned pregnancy, you can test it before birth during pregnancy. But then your only choice is, do you terminate the pregnancy? Do you have an abortion? Do you kill the fetus or not? If it's before the pregnancy is started, you can decide whether to start the pregnancy or not. There's a different set of issues, and let's see, where is it? I have a different book, this one, about editing embryos' DNA to change the DNA of an embryo from one set of variations to another. That raises still other kinds of questions. The most important for me right now is that the safety of that is completely unproven. So I'm not sure whether the question was about embryo selection, which is what I've been talking about, or whether it was about embryo editing, or whether it was about both.
Um,
And
we actually want to want to talk about both, actually.
okay, fine. Um, I think that embryo selection is likely to be much more important than embryo editing, in part because we know embryo selection is relatively safe. It's been done for 35 years. And I think if IVG, in vitro gametogenesis, becomes possible, it will become easier and more common. We don't know whether embryo editing is safe. There are reasons to believe that using CRISPR to edit can cause some very serious genetic problems. So far, we know of only 3 babies that were born after having their embryos edited. The 3 babies in China that Professor He Jiankui caused to be born in 2018, they're now almost 8 years old, 7.5 years old, and we have no idea how healthy they are. The Chinese government has released no information about their health. So we don't know how successful that is, how safe it is. Even if it does turn out to be safe, I'm not sure it will get used that much because everything, well, with the known genetic diseases, they're what we call monogenic diseases. One gene is responsible for major problems. One variation in one gene is responsible for major problems. Rather than take an embryo and try to change the bad form of the gene into a good form of the gene, why not just make several embryos and pick the ones that don't have the bad form of the gene? I think embryo selection is an easier and safer way of doing it than embryo editing. Embryo editing only is attractive if you can do, if to get the trait you want, you need to change lots and lots of genes. So let's say there are 10 genes that you need to have in a particular form in order to get the result you want. Somebody who, is a wonderful striker in football, James, although he's getting a little old now. But you need to have each of those 10 have the right variation. And there's a 50-50 chance it'll be the right variation or the wrong variation. Even if you're only looking for 10 and it's 50-50, that's 1 in 1,000. You'd have to make 1,000 embryos to have a decent chance to get one that has the variations you want. If you need 20 variations, then you're looking at 1,000,000 embryos. So if you're interested in traits that involve many genes, then embryo editing makes more sense. But we don't know any traits that we don't know the genes and the variations that are involved in multigenic traits. And I don't think we ever really will. I don't think we'll ever know what genes are important in making you a great futbolista, for example.
So, doctor, that's a specific explication. We want to know, considering your focus on the social implication of genetics, how should the law address the risk that embryo selection framed as private choice, may ultimately reform structural inequalities and produce population level patterns of preferred traits.
Yeah. So I think that's a great question. The issues of justice are important ethical and bioethical issues. In the end of sex, I call for, if this works, I call for it to be widely financially accessible to people so that it's not just something available to the rich. And I make an argument that this is actually likely to happen because the healthcare system um, would likely pay for it in order to avoid having to pay to treat subsequent diseases. They'd pay to avoid the disease, which would be less expensive than paying to treat the disease later. Even if it's financially available in rich countries or moderate income countries, it'll be a long time before it's financially available in really poor countries. The Central African Republic, Laos, Bolivia, those will have access to this much more slowly than richer countries. So there's, at a global level, there's likely to be a disparity in take up. Um, I think that's a bad thing, but I don't think it's such a bad thing that we should prohibit it. Rather than say nobody should have it, we should work hard to make sure everybody has it. And I'm less concerned about this than science fiction is, and that many people are who I think have an overly optimistic view of what we know. Uh, I don't think we will have super smart babies. I don't think we'll know the genetics for super smart babies. So if there is a lot of genetic selection, embryo selection, the babies will be somewhat healthier. They will be much less likely to have one of the 6 or 7,000 rare genetic diseases. Uh, I would like to see that true of everybody in the world who wants to take advantage of it. But even if it isn't, rich people or people in rich countries have, on average, healthier children than people in poor countries. We already see this. It's not a good thing, but I don't think the genetic side would add that much to it. That's all based on my belief, based on my understanding of the genetics and my guess, prediction about what we will understand in the future, that our ability to affect the traits of babies and subsequent adults will be limited to avoiding rare, nasty diseases, or maybe making some small difference in the likelihood that a person will get disease. Another issue there is, even if changing the genes is not the only, selecting the embryo is not the only way to deal with problems from genetic diseases. We could end up with treatments for them through gene therapy or through traditional drugs. One of the bigger nasty genetic diseases is cystic fibrosis. In a medical miracle that has not received much attention, over the last 5 years, 90% of people with cystic fibrosis are now able to lead lives of normal life expectancy and normal ability, normal function, thanks to three small molecule drugs. It's not a genetic change at all. It's just a drug change, but it basically almost completely treats their disease. So I don't think the genetic side is going to lead to huge transformations. Science fiction loves to portray, and I love science fiction. I read science fiction. I've even written a very bad, unpublished science fiction novel that I hope to go back to sometime. But science fiction loves dystopias, loves the extremes. That's because fiction in general needs conflict, it needs drama. Most of life isn't dystopias or utopias. Most of life we live somewhere in the middle. We never do things perfectly. We rarely do things terribly. Most of the time we just sort of muddle through. And so I don't think genetic selection or genetic editing is likely to be um, revolutionary. I think it's likely to lead to somewhat less disease and suffering. One can argue, and there are religious people who take this position, that suffering is a good thing. And I do think that sometimes suffering leads to good results. I've known people who have become better people, I think, as a result of suffering. But it doesn't always lead to good results. And one thing that suffering always leads to is suffering. And I think avoiding suffering is a good thing.
Okay, so doctor, taking that like a idea, we want to have a question about when individually rational decisions lead to problematic collective outcomes. Should the law assign responsibility to individuals, medical institutions, or the system as a whole?
So I think, except in clear cases, individuals should be able to make their own decisions about um, reproduction and medical interventions, as long as it mainly affects them. Uh, Social consequences of those decisions are often very hard to predict and even very hard to recognize when they happen. An example where I think intervention is appropriate is mandatory vaccination. When somebody makes a decision not to vaccinate their children against measles, that's a decision that parents make that affects the children, but it also affects their neighbors' children and all the children who go to school with their children. And so I think society has an interest and a right to say everybody has to get vaccinated against diseases, against common nasty diseases, if the vaccine has been proven safe and effective, which the vaccines have been. Um, but that's because the individual's decision has a clear, obvious effect on everybody else. If individual decisions about having babies or not affect the society, I think it's really hard to know what the long-term effects are going to be and whether they're positive or negative. Right now, we're beginning to see what I refer to as depopulation hysteria, at least in some parts of the world, where people are getting very upset about the decline in birth rates. And they're saying individual women's decisions not to have babies are hurting society and women should have more babies. Well, I think women should have the right to decide how many babies they want to have. And if they decide to have fewer babies and the population shrinks, so be it. The human population now is bigger than it's ever been in the history of humanity. 35 years ago, there were 5 billion of us. Now there are 8 billion of us. It wouldn't be a terrible thing if we went back to having only 5 billion of us. So people could say genetic selection or genetic editing could lead to a world with a genetic supercaste and a genetic lower class, could lead to different species of humans. I think that as a scientific matter is highly unlikely, if not impossible. And it's so unlikely that I wouldn't say, no, we won't let individual parents make this decision because we're afraid that this unlikely thing that would be bad for society will happen. So, as is almost always the case with any serious question I get asked, my answer is it depends. Dependa.
Okay, okay, we understand that. We actually have another question. As a context, you can depends. So this is the question. In a context where the reproductive technologies operate within market dynamics, how can the law prevent genetic selection from becoming a consumer product driven by commercial forces rather than medical or ethical considerations?
Well, in most societies now around the world, I think it's very hard, if not impossible, to keep anything from becoming in part a commercial issue, as well as an ethical issue and a medical issue and a health issue. Those all become intertwined. Somebody comes up with something that they think is medically better, and they will try to sell it and make money from it. What we can do and do in almost all countries is try to make sure what they're selling with a health story is safe and is effective. But that is the way that 21st century capitalism is working. And one can imagine trying to do away with capitalism. I don't know how successful that's likely to be. We look at the world's largest allegedly communist country in China, and its form of socialism looks an awful lot like capitalism. And they're very interested in making money and maximizing profits. So I think it would take a serious revolution in cultures nationally and internationally to get away from having some commercial interplay. But having some commercial role doesn't mean it has to be controlling. And so we can try and we can succeed sometimes in requiring that health stuff that's sold be shown to be safe and be shown to be effective. And there are things that we ban, even though they are effective, because we think there are bad social consequences, like drugs of abuse. We ban heroin, we ban cocaine, we ban a variety of drugs because we think they have bad social effects, even though there are individuals who want to use them, and even though there are people who make a lot of money from them. I will say, in this particular example, it's a good example that it's easier to say something is banned than to stop it, because despite decades and decades of trying to prevent illegal use of substances, drugs of abuse, no country has been very successful at stopping it. But there's probably less of it than there would be if we made it all legal.
Okay, that's productive thinking. So here we want to know if parents make decisions based on large volumes of complex genetics information, can we still meaningful speak of informed consent in legal terms?
Do the last part of that question again. If parents make
Like,
decisions based on lots of complex information, can we
yeah,
what?
still meaningfully speak of informed consent in legal
Uh,
terms?
so yes and no. It depends. I think that it is actually difficult to believe in informed consent as anything other than a lawyer's myth. Lawyers love informed consent. The law loves the idea of consent. But even in terms of consent to medical procedures like surgery, there's a fair amount of empirical evidence that people who have gotten consent, the next day they don't remember what they were told, or they remember it wrong, and in 2 weeks they've forgotten everything. We like the idea of consent. People rarely make, even on things that are fairly straightforward, it's, I think, unusual that people can truly make a completely informed decision. Some of the genetic issues are pretty straightforward. Things like Tay-Sachs disease is pretty straightforward genetically. Some are immensely complicated. I think that some parents will fully understand. Parents who are both geneticists will fully understand and will make a decision that they are comfortable with. Many parents will not fully understand it, but we can try to help them understand as far as possible. And I think some parts are possible. The details are complicated, in part because they usually involve probabilities, and humans are very bad at dealing with probabilities, or else lotteries would not exist if we were better at probabilities. You'll always, in the long run, lose in the lottery. But I think we need to make sure that information is available to parents about genetics. Genetic counselors, I think, do a very good job. They are often expensive, which is a problem. I think that online genetic education can be quite useful. But I think it's very important for people trying to make a genetic decision to be able to face talk to somebody knowledgeable who can help them understand the issues they should be thinking about with respect to the decision. However, as difficult as I think it would be for parents to make the decision about their families, I would rather have parents make a decision about their families in most cases, in almost all cases, than have a legislature make decisions about people's families. Because people know their families, they know their own interests, their own desires, their own beliefs, their own ethics better than a legislature does. So I think in general, parents should be able to make their own decisions. I think they should be given as much information as in as understandable a form as possible. But except at the extremes, they should be allowed to make the decisions they want. Will some of them make stupid or crazy decisions? Yes. There are 8 billion people on this planet, and some of them are very crazy. And some of those crazy people are parents. Are we better off having some parents make bad decisions than having legislatures make decisions for all parents? In general, I think yes. I think being a parent involves lots of very personal considerations and issues that really need to be decided by those involved. I am a parent. I have 2 children. One is 37, one is 34. I have now one grandchild, una nieta de 10 meses, who is the most amazingly wonderful creation that's ever been seen on Earth in 4.55 billion years. I think that being a parent is difficult, but very personal, and something that people should, in almost all circumstances, be able to make their own decisions about. And the exceptions are rare, and it's when things are really clear, like vaccinations for infectious disease, and where the effects go beyond are clearly go beyond the family and are not speculative future societal effects. Because having lived for 73 years, one thing I've realized is the future is a lot harder to predict than I thought it was. The last 10 years in particular of politics in the US and around the world have been very surprising to me. I'm not nearly as good at predicting the future as I thought I was.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Greely. We actually have a last question,
Okay.
but we actually want to know again what means euthanasia for you before the say last question.
I'm sorry, say that again.
Can you describe for you what means euthanasia?
Oh, oh, euthanasia? Okay,
Yes.
not eugenics, but euthanasia. Okay,
Yeah.
that's another term that means many things to many different people. Um, I think that so to tie it back to eugenics, uh, I think that we shouldn't use the word eugenics. We should talk about state required sterilization or government required genetic testing or parental decision making and not use eugenics. Rather than say euthanasia, we should be more specific and say um, patient suicide or physician assisted patient suicide or physician caused patient death. Be more specific rather than use the broader term, because the broader term encompasses so many different things. For me, I think for many people, if doctors, in consultation with the patient or the patient's families, decide to disconnect it, to turn off a breathing machine, I don't consider that euthanasia. I consider that the withdrawal of life support and something that individual patients and their families should be able to do, I think, although different cultures and different countries and different religions will take different views of that. It gets harder if a doctor just injects something to kill somebody. If they do that to somebody who is conscious and competent and has asked for it and is not mentally ill, then I think, and is suffering and is near the end of life, then I personally would think that is ethical. If they do that because they think the person should not, is suffering too much and should be, quote, put out of their misery, close quote, but the person involved disagrees, I don't think you should do that. So, like eugenics, I think euthanasia is a term that gets used very broadly, and you have to look at the various specific kinds of applications. Again, on in general, my own preference is for individual decision making rather than decision making that is one size fits all, where a decision is made that's intended to cover all circumstances. I think the people, in most cases, the people most directly affected should be able to make decisions that they think are the right decisions as long as they are competent adults. What is the status of physician-assisted dying in Colombia? Is it legal?
Um,
Is it illegal?
it's actually illegal. That
Okay.
means.
Okay.
Okay,
Abortion is
doctor.
legal in Colombia now.
Yeah, actually, it's a portion.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think is so interesting about Latin America, despite the strong Catholic background in Latin America, some countries have moved away from the church's teachings and some haven't, and sometimes in some topics, but not in others. Spain, a very Catholic country, is the center of IVF in Europe, even though the Vatican thinks IVF is at least doubly sinful. So the interplay between religion and legislation in these issues is not always straightforward. Depende.
Uh, that's true. Um, Doctor, we have only one last question, and then we can
Bueno,
continue to the close of the seminar. Yeah, that's probably
tengo que enseñar
okay.
en,
And the last, do you believe the law should attempt to preserve certain human values in the face of technologies capable of reducing them, or its role to adapt to whatever choice society is willing to accept?
so say that one more time, please.
Okay, I'm gonna say it again. Do you believe the law should attempt to preserve certain human values in the face of the technologies capable of redesigning them, or is the role to adapt to whatever choices society is willing to accept?
The answer is yes, A or B, yes, some of both. So I do think that the law and society and cultures should have the power to make decisions about what they want to be in the future, protecting, in some cases, their culture from technologies. I think that in some cases that will prove to be impossible. I think it's going to be very, very hard for societies to protect themselves from the effects of the internet. This little supercomputer that I carry around in my pocket, there are billions of people all around the world who have smartphones. And I don't think very few countries are going to be able to stop the changes that came from that. Very few countries have been able to stop the changes that came with automobiles. And that have come with the ability to do successful contraception. There are technological changes that societies can try to block, but are unlikely to be successful in blocking. In general, my own view is that individual decision making, the ability of individuals to make decisions for themselves or families to make decisions for themselves should be one of the highest values to be respected, but it's not the only one. And I think that, so here's to me the deepest problem. Are there universal human rights or not? If there are universal human rights, a society should not be able to do things that violate them. So if freedom of religion is a universal human right, a society should not be able to say everyone in our society has to be a Baptist or has to be Catholic or Muslim or Hindu or anything else. Are there universal human rights? I want to believe the answer is yes, but where do they come from? What are they? What's the list? How do we know what they are? Those are really hard questions that I don't have good answers to. And so I do think that societies can and should try to protect their peoples from the harms of technologies. I think sometimes they will find that possible, sometimes they will find that impossible. And what harms of technologies should people be protected against, even though they want to adopt them, becomes very difficult. Is there should we establish an international right to the internet? Is that a human right? I don't know. And in a way, the fact that I don't know, I find kind of encouraging. I sort of like the idea that that the future will make itself in ways that I do not know and cannot predict, and I might end up liking or might end up not liking. But really, the future belongs to the people who live in the future. The future does not belong to those of us today. It belongs to the world 100 years from now belongs to the people who will be living in it 100 years from now. It doesn't belong to you and me. The world 30 years from now doesn't belong to me, but it will belong to you. So life's complicated, and that's not a bad thing. It makes life more interesting.
Yeah, sure. It's very complicated, doctor. And then our time is up, actually. It's an honor have you here. You spend your time in here. Thank you very much for your participation, doctor. And we apologize for the internet connection issues.
It was fine, and some of it may just be my old ears.